Hi, my name is Keely from Abound Bindery, and this is my new series, Real Time Rebinds. So many of you have reached out to say how helpful it is to keep things in real time, so I thought this would be a fun way to keep sharing the things I've been working on. I'll still be talking you through what I do, but it'll be less of a tutorial and more of a chatty rebind video that you can watch while you're bookbinding, so grab a drink and let's get binding. Today I'm going to be rebinding The Will of the Many by James Islington. Now I know it's been out for a while, but a friend only recently told me about it and oh my god, I literally cannot wait for the next one. I read it on Kindle and then immediately bought 2 physical copies. I immediately knew what I wanted to design for a rebound cover, but I'm not gonna lie, ripping the cover off this one hurt. It is such a beautiful book. I won't go into detail in case you haven't read it, but that ending, honestly, I want to talk to everyone about it. First up here, I'm making the head and end bands for the book. I'm doing this first because they need time to dry before I can actually use them, and it's also one of the first steps when we get to preparing our book. Usually I'm really organised and either have a stash or I'll make it the night before I want to rebind, but this was a bit of an impulsive project. I have already done a separate tutorial on how to make your own head and end bands, and I actually recently posted a tutorial on how to make your own book cloth as well, and that's the material I'm using here, so feel free to check both of those out if you're interested. One tip I do have is don't be like me. Always use less glue than you think you'll need, which I clearly do not do here. Realistically, I sit here and do this for another 5 minutes, so let's just speed through the next little bit and we can get into preparing our book. I warned you, this part hurts. It's such a beautiful cover and I love the reference to the Roman culture. I see there's actually been a new cover announced that'll be released next year. I'll put a picture in here because I'm not sure how I feel about it. I don't love the realistic cover, but it did help me picture some of the concepts in the book. Tell me what covers you guys prefer. So to catch us up, we've made our head and end bands, ripped the cover of our book, and now we're taking our measurements. I actually take an incorrect measurement here, which will show up in the not too distant future, but this is also where I start to calculate the size of my book boards based off these measurements as well. For my end papers, I wanted to keep it simple with these black ones. I also was nervous I wouldn't have any paper big enough because the width of the book was just over 15 centimeters and the biggest paper I have is 30 centimeters, which when folded in half would only come to 15. Luckily it worked out fine, but you do see me double check here before I keep moving. And this is where my bad measuring bites me in the ass. Luckily, I measured too big, so I could just cut the extra off, but I do get lazy here, and instead of remeasuring, I just line it up with the height of the book and cut it off from there. I feel like this way is less precise, which is why I don't do it this way from the start, but to each their own. Now we're on to gluing the end papers onto the book. People always reach out to me and are concerned when they think the book is only attached to the hardcover by this thin line of glue, but the book is mainly attached with the mold that we use later on. We're just giving the book extra stability by having glue here. I'm taking my time making sure this page is straight, because if this is crooked, it will be really hard to make it not look like it has been cased in crooked later on. Right about here is where I mark the front and back of the book. I check this at least 10 times throughout the entire process because I know how easy it is to forget or mess up and end up casing your book in upside down. Touch wood, this hasn't happened to me yet. Now we can get on with preparing our book. I use a book press I made out of chopping boards and bolts, but you can use whatever you have. I know a lot of people use C-clamps between chopping boards. It's up to you whether you attach the ribbon to the top or bottom of your book. The general rule I stick to is if I want to hang a charm off the book, I'll attach it to the bottom so the charm hangs from the top. But if I'm not, I'll just attach it to the top. I'm not using a charm in this rebind, so you can see here I'm just attaching the ribbon to the top. And here I'm just using a standard 9mm black ribbon to match the end pages. Our head and end bands have also finished drying, so I'm going to cut them to size and glue them on now as well. Now it's time to add our mull. To be honest, it's just a lot of gluing at this stage, and I take back my earlier advice of not to use too much glue. You can't use too much glue here. The mull is what attaches the book to the hardcover, and the glue provides so much of that stability. The reason why mull is such a good material is because it's a really loose weave. There's so much space for that glue to seep in and give the mull structure. We can't do anything else with the book or text block until the glue has dried, so you can just put this in a sunny place and we'll move on to making our hardcover case. The dreaded measurements for cutting your book board. I know quite a few people get stuck on how to add or subtract to get the right size book board, so I might take a second to talk us through this again. So when I make a book, I like to aim for a 3mm overhang from the hardcover to the actual book. So this means I need to add 6mm to the height of my book. I'll usually do 7mm because I can always trim off the excess later. Then for the spine, I need to account for the width of the spine plus the thickness of my front and back boards. These boards are around 1.2mm thick, so again, I round up and just add 3mm to the width of the spine. Moving on to the width of the book, I think this is where people get the most stuck because it changes depending on how wide your hinge gap is. Because this is a bigger book, I'm going to use a 1cm hinge gap, but to be honest, it's been a while since I've last bound a book and I can't remember exactly what I would need to add or subtract from the width of my book. So I'm actually going to play it safe, and this is what I would also recommend for anyone else who isn't sure, and I just keep the book board the same width as the book. I suspect later on down the track, I'll need to trim some of the excess off, but I can do that later. And what I might do is I'll add the exact measurements that I end up using for this rebind in the description below, so you can see what I end up using along with the original measurements. that my boards are all cut to size, I'm going to start assembling my case. To do this, I'm going to use a piece of cardstock, the exact same type that I used for my front and end pages, to glue everything to, and this is going to form the foundation of my case. The reason why we flip this over and attach the boards to the other side is because we don't want the seam of the cardstock showing through on our cover. This way, the card isn't going to pull away from the spine and you'll have a nice smooth finish on the front. that the foundation of our case is done, we want to do a dry fit to make sure it's the right size before we start gluing on any fabric. As I mentioned before, I think I'll need to trim this down slightly, so it's really important that I don't skip this step. Now, the glue on my book is still drying, so it's going to make doing a dry fit a little bit tricky. I could be patient and wait until it's dry enough, or I could use a hairdryer on the cool setting to speed things up a bit. Now that I have my case and text block ready, I'm going to do a dry fit, which just means I'm going to put it together without any glue and check for spacing. This is going to make sure that we end up with a hardcover case that perfectly fits our book. As I expected, you can see here that the overhang is a little bit too big on the width of the case. To fix this, I'm going to measure the top space and then trim the sides to be the same. I end up taking off roughly 1/2 centimetre here. If you needed to take any off the height of the book, you could also do that at this point. Now we'll do one last dry fit to double check we're happy, because there's no going back once we glue on the fabric. Now it's time to glue our hardcover to the book cloth. You can use whatever book cloth you like. This is some that I made myself using cotton fabric and heat and bond. I also have a tutorial on how you can make this yourself. It's a great option if you want a really specific colour, or if you're like me and don't have many book cloth options in your area. Please tell me I'm not the only one who finds peeling the dried glue off my brush really satisfying. I always start by gluing the spine because I feel like you're less likely to get fabric bunched up in the wrong spot, and if I tried to glue it all at once, the glue would just dry too quickly. Take my time making sure there's glue in all the hinge gaps here as well. The silicone paintbrush isn't great for this. I think it would work better if you had a normal paintbrush, but I hate having to get glue out of those. If you have the patience for it, I would probably recommend that here instead. Applying a bit too much glue here, story of my life, and you'll see when I turn it over that the glue seeps through the fabric a little. This will leave glue marks that I won't be able to get rid of, so let this be a warning to you about using too much glue. I'm not too concerned though, because I will be covering this part up with heat transfer vinyl, so you shouldn't be able to tell in the end. As always, you want to get your bone folder and really work those hinges to get them nice and crisp. If you don't have a bone folder, the end of a permanent marker works perfectly here. I have all the tools and you'll still see me reach for it. little close up of those glue marks. I'm going to trim the excess book cloth now, and while technically this is an optional step, it gives your book such a clean finish because you do see these lines through the end paper, so I think it's worth doing. I leave a very exact measurement of 1 ruler's width, which is roughly an inch or a couple of centimeters here. Now we'll trim the corners so you don't end up with a bulk of fabric when you fold the edges in. 3.5mm is the perfect size if your boards are roughly 1.2mm thick. This corner cutting tool is definitely not a necessity. You could absolutely eyeball it, but I love using it. It gives me the perfect corners every time. I have this one linked in my supplies link below, but they sell out so quickly every time they're released, so you have to get in quick. Now we're going to fold down our edges. I always start with the long sides and then do the short sides last. I don't know why, that's just how I was taught, so that's what I do. Difference when I do the short sides is that you want to turn in your corners. This is so you're not left with little bits of fabric sticking out of them. I just push these in with the tip of my bone folder, and then the process is exactly the same as the long sides. Do want to show you here is how, as the glue has dried, it's warping the cover and giving it a really distinct curve. This is easily fixed by putting something flat and heavy on it for an hour while it finishes drying. I'm going to put it in my book press, but you could use a chopping board with some books stacked on it, anything, and it'll come out flat in the end. While I leave it to dry, I'm going to cut out the design with my silhouette and heat transfer vinyl, and I'll come back to show you how it's applied. Here it is an hour later, and you can see it's completely flat. Now to prepare my cover to have the heat transfer vinyl applied, I'm going to get a mini lint roller and make sure there's no fluff on the cover, otherwise it will get stuck with the HTV. Now for the dreaded HTV. This is notoriously hard to apply, but I have chosen white this time, which is generally easier to work with over metallics. I'm going to apply this with my mini heat press, so to protect my cutting mat from the heat, I'm going to put a chopping board down first. Your heat transfer vinyl may come with temperature settings, but if not, I find the middle setting is generally a safe bet. While that heats up, I'm going to make sure everything is aligned properly. You could use a ruler for this and measure, but sometimes that overcomplicates things, and the most important thing is that it looks centered, so just do whatever you feel comfortable doing here. The idea here is that you iron it on and then peel the plastic backing away, leaving just the design behind. The issue is that it often doesn't all adhere properly and you start to pull away parts of the design when you do this. If this starts happening to you, just lay it back down and ensure the vinyl is all where it should be, and just keep on ironing it over again. With metallics, they almost always need to be peeled completely cool, so you do have to wait between each attempt, but I promise it pays off in the end. If you do still have issues, you might have to look at the brands you're using. I found that the Cricut brand is much easier to use than others, especially when it comes to the metallics. Because this isn't metallic, it's a bit more resilient, but you'll see I do still have issues when it comes to peeling the backing off. Now that I feel like I've applied heat evenly over the whole design, I'm using a burnishing tool to rub firmly over the design. This is because too much heat can damage both your cover and the HTV, but you want to make sure it's adhered as well as it can. While that cools, I'm going to follow that exact process for the spine and the back cover. it's cool, I'm going to attempt to peel the plastic backing off the front cover. Very quickly, I can see that it's still peeling off the design, so I know I'm going to need to go over it with heat again. Now that I've let the second round cool, I can try again. This time I get much further, but I still start to peel off the design. The difficulty with straight lines is there isn't much room for forgiveness, and it's really noticeable if a line is wonky. Here you'll see I go in with one of my tools to straighten it out before ironing it down again. What I also start to notice is it's peeling away really nicely straight after I've used the heat. I've long lost the instructions for this HTV, but I'm thinking it might be one that you're meant to peel warm, and I end up having heaps more success that way. I'm not too concerned if there are any little bits lifting at this point, because what I do is get a fresh piece of baking paper and go over this with heat again. This makes sure that everything is adhered really well to the fabric. Now to do that another 2 times. there you go, you've survived the trauma of applying HTV and you're left with your finished hardcover. Now all we have left to do is case in our book and leave it in the press overnight. To case in your book, you first start by placing the text block in the case. Triple check, and I cannot stress this enough, that you are not putting it in upside down. Everything should line up properly from this point because we did a dry fit earlier on, and we just need to make sure it's center. Once you're happy with the positioning, you can gently place it back on your mat, being careful not to bump anything out of place. From here, it's really important we don't accidentally move this so everything lines up how it should in the end. I carefully open the cover and apply the glue to the front page, making sure the mull is fully coated, but not applying so much that it's going to warp the pages. I should also mention that I've placed a piece of scrap paper under the page to ensure any runoff doesn't glue my pages together, but the paper also helps absorb any moisture from the glue to stop the pages from warping. After I'm happy with the glue, I'll take out the paper and replace it with a piece of baking paper so that if there is any glue residue, it'll peel off easier. I may also be foreshadowing here an issue that I come across later. Once the glue is evenly spread out, I slowly close the hardcover over the page, applying pressure from the spine towards the edge of the book. I'll do a quick check at this point to see if it's glued in straight. The glue dries so quickly you really don't have much time if it's not straight. At this point, we've done all we can for this book and it's time to put it in the press or under some weights overnight. after I do this, I take the opportunity to trim the ribbon, and I'll use a flame to seal the edges so that it doesn't fray. Now it's time to say goodnight, and we'll be back tomorrow. This is the next day, and it's time to take our finished book out of the press. What you're seeing here is the harsh reality of bookbinding. I think this first piece of baking paper that I used had a line of dried glue on it, and after pressing it in the book overnight, it stuck to the inside of the cover. Thankfully, I did use baking paper, so while it has left a mark, it would have been a lot worse if it was paper. It is a little bit annoying, but there are always going to be mistakes and things that we can improve on. Thankfully, this page comes out perfectly, and this is what you should be aiming for. Other than the glue on the front page, I'm really happy with how this turned out. If you do have any tips on how to get rid of that glue residue though, let me know in the comments below. I had such a fun time making this, and I hope you all learned a few things as well. To recap some of the rules, we had rule number 1, don't use too much glue. Rule number 2, ignore that rule, use as much glue as you can. And then rule number 3, which was, I take that back, please don't use too much glue. If you've made it this far through, well done. I'd love to hear what videos you want to see more of. I have something really exciting coming in the mail, which will hopefully be a good option for those of you wanting to rebind, but don't have a silhouette or a cricket. I'm also keen to answer some frequently asked questions in my next chatty rebind video, so drop some questions below, and I might even put a poll up on my Instagram, but it could be binding related, book related, or even personal questions. Just let me know what you want to hear. As always, tag me in your bookbinding videos. I love to see what you all get up to. There are so many people doing things so much more creative than me, but follow along for more videos to bind to.